Produce annotations that would teach people how to read lists for themselves. If the ledger could make names of us, we would make names ourselves. The greatest trial came when Renaud's eyes drifted closer. News travels faster in a city full of noses than one might suppose. A minor official arrested a small-time courier. Under pressure, he named the printer's address in a breath that for him was self-preservation. Renaud's squad came in the morning like weather. Tyne had burnt his plates, and yet had not burned the evidence of hours and nights, and in a different ledger the memory of his clients. The scars on his hands, he was still readable. The men searched cabinets and boxes. They found nothing. We had hidden what we could. But in a city governed by lists, suspicion is itself a ledger that never closes. At midday, Renaud himself passed by the shop. He did not speak, but his gaze lingered in a way that felt like a hook. We had produced for a moment a fissure. Doubt had been sown. That is not the same as victory. The grain of the struggle now was moral. We had damaged a system at the price of personal ruin for Tian, and perhaps permanent danger for himself and for us. Had we done the right thing? When a ledger names you, and you are allowed the space to answer, are you moral for seeking to erase the ink, or do you become the kind of usurper you once feared? Father Benoti told me, in a voice made small by care, that ethics are not tidy. He said, we act as our consciences allow, and the world will name those acts whatever it pleases. There was, in that sentence, a consolation and an indictment. We had acted. The ledger's tyranny had been resisted. But in the days following, rumor hardened into policy. Renaud tightened searches. A printers' guild sent a delegation warning of the dangers of what we had done. Merchants, fearing the extension of suspicion to commerce, kept their distance. Tyner's shop fell quieter than a nave after Vespers. People who had once ordered a pamphlet now omitted him from their business, as if his hands carried contagion. Yet something else had been set into motion that night by the press' small thudding. Outsiders began to look at a ledger differently. A woman who sold cloth at the market told me, with a fierce little gleam in her eye, that she had no wish to be named by paper. If they tell me I die on Thursday, she said, I will not wear blue so the clerk can recognize me. I will buy a red shawl, and they will have to find me by my own feet. It was not heroic, it was practical. It was the slow, private work of people, refusing to be reduced to entries. The counterfeit had not simply saved a life that week. It had taught an emboldened smallness of resistance. The cost, again, was visible in Tian's spare bills, in the chamber where he no longer had plates stacked as a craftsman's pride. In the little ways he passed by the shop as if avoiding some emblem of himself. He would survive, perhaps, but he would not be the same. There are trades that are a kind of character, and when you cut away the tools that formed that character, you do not simply make a man poorer. You alter the grammar by which he speaks. At night, when the city slept and the guillotine's shadow was only an idea along the pavements, I sat at my counter with pen and ledger and wrote marginalia for those who might come after us. I wrote instructions on how to read a clerk's flourish, how to spot the difference between a hurried scribe and a deliberate hand. I hid the notes in bindings and under false bottoms and in the seam of a well-loved book about arithmetic. The pages were not grand manifestos. They were small, practical lessons, the sort that teach a child to read before teaching him to argue. We had burned plates to make a counter-truth, and in doing so we had taught a different, quieter subversion. Knowledge itself could be the small turning of a key. The ledger had not been silenced entirely. Renaud's men still walked the streets with their ledgers and their quills. But in the litany of our little acts there had been a new verb, to annotate, to marginalize authority with the ink of those it had named. That perhaps would be the long work of the bookshop beneath the guillotine. The chapter of sacrifice closed as night thickened and the lamps in the street guttered. Tyne sat with a cup of cold tea and pushed his thumb over the rim the way a man touches a coin for luck. He did not speak unless spoken to. Words felt too expensive. Lucy leaned her head on my shoulder and slept like a child exhausted by bravery. Father Benot rid a small office by a lantern, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet but bright. Then, as if to remind us that no quietness is safe for long, a knock came at the door. Not the hesitant rap of a friend, but a brisk, official tap, each blow stating a claim. My heart had learned, by then, to listen for those rhythms. Tiny's hand tightened on the cup. Outside, the street was ordinary, a cart rolled, a dog barked somewhere. Yet that single sound had the weight of a summons. We unlatched the chain as if opening a trapdoor. I took a breath that tasted of ink and smoke and the indeterminate future. I have long thought that a salon is like a ledger. Only the entries are gestures, and the columns run through laughter and sighs. There are ledgers with ink-straight hands and lettered certainties, and there are ledgers made of the soft, less certain things, glances, borrowed phrases, the tilt of a cup on a saucer. Madeline's salons keep both kinds. And in the way she tended them, I began to see a manner of ledger, keeping in which the hands of women and men recorded decisions under their breath. When I told her, over a pressed slice of lemon and bread, that I would need a rumour to move like a piece on a board, her hands were the first to answer me. That is how this chapter begins, with a handkerchief folded 3 times and the precise meeting of palms that can mean yes, no, wait, or go now. She sat me at the small table beneath the portrait that used to hang when her husband was alive, an old man in a white wig, who now looked smaller because the house had been stripped to necessities. The room retained the smell of starch and boiled broth, and every object seemed to have been set in the memory of some better day, so that its present need might be borne with a smile. She was dressed as if to argue with scarcity, a rusted green bodice that betrayed her waist, a sleeve patched with a pale square that caught the light when she lifted her glass. Her fingers had that peculiar steadiness of people whose survival was made of social dexterities. They could fold a letter and a lie into the same crease. "You want me to say something," she said, and there was no scorn, only the small, fluent amusement of someone who knows the value of words. "You want me to put a story where there is fear, to take the ledger by the wrist and lead it a little astray." "Yes." I put the packet of marginalia between us, a narrow stack of pages that smelled of glue and lemon oil, the ink of teens press not yet fully set. Not a lie that will kill anyone, though, who can tell with lies, but a story plausible enough to make an officer hesitate, a clerk misfile, a footman say, "I must have misremembered," instead of "Yes, that's right." Time is all we ask for. Time to move, to hide, to make plates vanish. Time so men can be absent when a list becomes command. She pinched her lower lip. "You have learned to make things dangerous from paper, Marie. You must have been bored as a child." "Boredom makes an inventory of everything it can touch," I said. "It taught me to count faces and to know the weight of a name when it's placed on a line." Lucy slipped into the doorway at that moment, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes alight with the idea that anything could be done if one simply wanted it enough. "Madeline," she said, breathless with excitement and impatience both, "they will be at the fair on Wednesday." Bastien said so. "If you say the right thing at supper, if you arrange who hears, then the magistrate will have to take another route. They can't be in 2 places." Madeline looked at her as if she liked the creature but did not entirely trust its claws. "You think you can rearrange the city like a set of cards, child?" she asked, but the look she gave Lucy was indulgent. Lucy had the sort of light in her that frightened me. She would throw herself off a roof for some idea if she thought the roof would rise up with her. "We move the rumour toward authority," I said. "A footman mentions the fair, the laundress mentions the fair. A clerk notes a deportation and someone else notes a delay. Everything in the city has to be decided by someone who writes it down, make the writing come later. And so we set the table of our little conspiracy." Tyne provided plates that had been cleaned of their original imprint and relettered with a different false history. He kept the plates under his mattress and in the chimney where the heat pretended to forget them each night. He was careful by temperament and by terror. His past had taught him that a mistake of ink could become a mistake of life. Bastien would carry the first leaflets into the street the night we set the rumor. He moved like a shadow and liked the permission to run with something that might be important. Hortense had, by her calling and habit, a fleet of ears laundresses and maids who appeared at laundries and talked as if the world were a long shirt to be pressed. We needed her, though I would have preferred her not to feel the dread deep within her bones. Madeleine taught me how to use her hands. I had seen hands direct before Tyrannus when he placed a matrix on a press, Jean Morel's when he chose a folder to mislay, but Madeleine's hands were different. They were social instruments tuned to the frequencies of polite suspicion. She could fold a napkin and, with the fold, suggest a date had been moved. She could take someone's sleeve and pinch it in a way that meant do not send him out without ever forming the sentence. People in the room read her as a hostess. They never suspected they were being guided like a flock toward a gate that opened away from the blade. The night of the gathering was mild for October. A moon, thin as a coin, watched from above the eaves. Madeleine's back parlor, filled with the kinds of people who still believed themselves immune to the ledger, because they had fingers on the scales of rumor. A clerk who liked small, safe rebellions against his superiors. An ex-mistress whose husband had been executed, and who nevertheless used society for leverage as if it were currency. A magistrate's cousin who liked to hear scandal, but had only ever applied it as a kind of salt to conversation. When they entered, they shed coats and sorrow and found seats, and the room hummed with the false security of shared laughter. Madeleine's voice was light as she told a story about a merchant who had taken sick on the road. It was a small tale, properly delivered, with a casual aside about a planned trip to the fair. The hostess' hands moved at the exact moment of the aside. She brushed a ringlet from her brow, and in the confusion of movement, she slid a folded scrap of paper, one of Tyne's counter lists, beneath a stack of calling cards. The clerk who found it laughed and read aloud, and the laugh made the air swallow the significance of the paper. In the next room, a footman repeated to his master, swallowing details into the cloth of retelling, and that repetition migrated down the road like a stain. We had rehearsed this choreography in the weeks before. Who would say what? How the clerk would be made to find a list rather than seize an order. How the footman would be distracted at the right time by a neighbor's trouble. The beauty of the thing, if there could be beauty in such necessity, was that it was so ordinary. No one at first suspected an organized art. Rumor paid for itself by being just plausible enough. I watched the room as I always watch a book I mean to understand. Faces turned and told me their margins. A woman across the table, thin-lipped, with a laugh always ready bent to hear a soft conspiratorial phrase, and left believing it was her own thought expanded. Lucy stood by the hearth, hands warming and heart moving as if the heat might fuel something braver than herself. Bastien paced near the door, a packet of leaflets that smelled of dust and ink clenched in one hand. The air smelled of pressed lemon, wax, and the faint fur of a cat that liked to sleep upon decayed embroidery. The first hour passed and nothing happened. That is the cruelest part of such affairs. You must feel as if you are a reed in a river, hoping the current will take the small object you have placed upon it. Then a magistrate's cousin, thinking himself clever, announced to the room that he had heard the men in question were to be moved to another house. He delivered this with the complacency of a man who likes to be the source of a rumor. Madeleine smiled and asked him about a detail. She already knew which house. When, who drove them, and as he hemmed she gave him his closure with a word that directed the direction of his memory. It is difficult to say how, exactly, one persuades the world that one remembers a fact differently than before. It is easier to observe the effect, The cousin repeated the phrase to a neighbor on the street. The neighbor, who had been appointed a liaison for the tribunal, delayed a dispatch that would have carried an order. In the ledger of the city, an entry missed a day. We celebrated then, in a small way, with the paper's rustle and the taste of roasted chestnuts and the pride of having moved a thing the size of a name. Men who would otherwise have been taken that morning slept another night in their own beds. There is no joy I can describe that is unalloyed in those months. Even triumph was threaded with the fear that it would be the very engine of our undoing. Madeline's smile, when it came, did not reach her eyes. I suppose a woman can be both delighted at her skill and frightened by the way her neighbors will use it. The consequence arrived as consequences do, not as a thunderclap but as a slow, insistent seep. A laundress in the Rue of the Market, Hortense's friend, was frightened by the attention bestowed at the salon. She went home and, in a gesture both practical and stupid, told a woman she'd been ironed with that the magistrate had changed his mind, and included details she had not heard but invented to make the story coherent. That invented detail reached a clerk who liked to know where his own name fit into a narrative, and, in the dryness of daily bureaucratic habit, he sent a query. Queries beget notes. Notes beget orders. The web of our maneuver gathered a new strand. That strand turned, in a way we had not predicted, into something the tribunal could follow backward. Madeline felt the cost first. A former friend, one we had thought safely on our side because of a debt unpaid, began to look at her with that small, calculating anger that the revolution returns when one manipulates acquaintance into advantage. She had, as most of us do, both pride and shame. That friend told a story in a bar, and at the bar the story acquired a detail: is she hiding papers? That made it sound like a thing more grievous than a small social adjustment. When such a suspicion begins, it has its own gravity. People lean into it, as if to confirm the suspicion through their interest. Madeline, who had once been the hostess of a salon where her husband's name brought status, discovered that social grace could become social liability if the right person decided to read it as subversion. "You have made me vulnerable," she said to me the morning after, when she came to the shop, and the city's dampness had not yet lifted from her shoulders. "Not because I fear prison, my friends have taught me to figure that, but because I have lost the currency I traded on. People who once found me amusing now watch for ropes in my knitting." I put my hands to the counter and told her, as plainly as I knew how, that we had bought time. "They are not taken today," I said. "That is not nothing." She looked at me for a long time. "You have made this a ledger of favors, Mary. You hand me a page and ask me to fold it into a life. But favors have interest. Banks are patient. The money comes due." And that was the point that the ledger never wholly conveyed. Our acts accrued human costs that did not appear on any formal page. Tian, to his credit, did not complain about the risk. He only worried aloud about the plates. He said, "As printers say, that a press remembers what it has printed and will betray you if it is given time." He burned a plate that night in a little iron pot and watched the black curl of metal fall into a heap like a small confession. Lucy danced around the gravity of such acts and, with youth's foolishness, called our success proof that action works. She had started to believe that one can make history like one presses a page, one action, one print, one effect. I did not think in such simple geometries. I know that one reprieve might save a man from the scaffold, but will not stop the machinery that feeds the scaffold without a larger effort. Yet I too felt the small, warm satisfaction of having done something that mattered. The men who had been named walked another day, under the same low roofs of their houses, and one of them left a note slid between the floorboards of my shop, thanking me as if gratitude were a thing that could be untied from consequence. There is also the private arithmetic of reputation. Madeline's hand had moved people for our end, and the people moved now watched her with new calculation. Rumor that visits a salon lingers. It changes the way people sit at tables and the way servants answer doors. A woman who used to attract confidences now attracted questions. I saw it in the twitch of her jaw when she spoke. I saw it in the way a friend who had once flattered her left the room earlier than usual. That is the cost of manipulation. You alter the way a town knows you, and sometimes that is worse than a prison. We tried to repair what we could. I wrote marginalia that read as casual notes from a clerk and slipped them into the tradesmen's ledgers we knew the tribunal read in the mornings. Bastien spread the leaflets with a zeal that pleased him and made him feel grown. Hortense hummed with relief and fear in equal parts, and when she told me of a kitchen maid who had been approached by a man with a ledger's neat hand, I felt again the cold spike of the danger that sat beneath our palms like a stone. The ledger is patient and institutional. Rumor is quick and brittle. One can buy days with it, but one cannot buy the stamp of permanence that gives the tribunal its authority. At the end of the week the men were still free. The immediate objective had been secured. Yet as we sat that evening with chestnuts and stale bread, the room felt slightly out of balance. Something had shifted in the city's social calculus. Friends walked with hands in their pockets and voices that measured themselves more carefully. Madeleine's eyes had ceded some of their light. She kept folding her handkerchief and refolding it, as if checking the seams of a garment to see whether rope could be hidden there. I do not mean to end this chapter on a domestic image of doom. There was something electric in the reprieve. I felt it as a woman feels the small warmth of a bed made newly for her, knowing that the night's chill might still come. And yet I want to be honest, the ledger learns faster than we do. It will rechart its lists. It will make men named who were safe today redundant tomorrow. Our salvage of time is not a defeat of the mechanism. It is a puncture in a tire. We must keep moving while the air leaks. The hook that lingers at the edge of my comfortable little narration is that the city's ledger does not like being thwarted. People who hold institutional pens will be tempted to correct, to punish, to reassert their authorship. When a city tastes the possibility that names can be shifted and that the instrument of naming can be read as instrument, it begins to change a little, but not without backlash. The evening after our success, as I closed the shop and ran my fingers along the spines I had not glanced at for a week, a cold letter was pushed under my door. It bore no seal. It had one line in a hand both neat and edged. We notice when things move differently. In the margin someone had added, as if to make the sentence a ledger, the word tomorrow. Madeleine's hands lay on the counter beside mine. We counted, in silence, the extra day we had bought and the sum it would cost us in the end. The city slept, and I, who measure my life by the weight of paper, tried to imagine where this day's paper would be filed when the tribunal searched their ledgers for the source of their unease. The edges of the world had shifted perceptibly, like a page turned in a thick volume. Someone was reading us now, and someone else was writing in the margin. I locked the shop and felt the latch click like a verdict. The line between our cunning and their counter-cunning had grown narrower. I folded my own hands ink-stained, patient, and thought of how easily one hand can betray another. Outside, a carriage rattled and a dog barked. In the distance, a bell marked the hour. I put the packet of marginalia into a false bottom I rarely used and wrapped my scarf round my neck. Lucy was waiting in the lane, thirsty for the next action as if it were the next page. I told her to be cautious, to wait for a signal that might come in Madeleine's hands or in a note beneath the pew. She laughed at caution, and for a long moment I envied her. Then I looked again at the scrap of paper pushed under my door. The word tomorrow had been underlined twice. There was an economy to threats. They need not be long to be effective. I set the light low and began, with calm fingers, to write the marginalia for the next day. I had thought, in the abstracted hours of copying and binding, that familiarity with lists made one sleep decently. The names were lines on paper, and lines warmed a hand with their ordinariness. I had learned to catalogue the city, and its passing in columns, the grocer's ledger, the parish register, the small chew of marginalia that announced a rumour as though it were a fact. Yet the executioner and those who kept his tools had always belonged to a class of reality I noticed but did not touch. They were the last articulators of a verdict. They took words and made soundings out of them, and in that noise the flesh was accounted for. That boundary cracked when the journeyman came to my doorway and left a smell of wood and oil in the shop, an elegiac trace of his presence that ink could not wash away. He said his name at the threshold like a man renting airthophile, and his hands stayed closed around the hood of his coat, as if it were something too expensive to expose. I measured him by the scratches on his nails, and the way his voice could be clean and abrupt like a polished plane. He was not an informer who wanted to trade quartered pieces of rumour for bread. He was someone who had watched how lists became law and had learned to keep a ledger of his own to make sense of them. Repairs noted in the margin. The arrival of a wagon counted, as if it were a footnote to a person's sentence. It astonished me when he accepted tea and sat near the front counter as if it were a table at which confessions might be served. "Why come to me?" I asked, because that was the first, honest thing. I have the shop and a name. My reasons are plain enough. The ledger had made my name legible, and legible things draw a different kind of breath. Because when lists are the language of death, he said, someone must be able to read them in another tongue. He told me without ceremony that the executioner kept no single book of fate. Guillotine, the woman whose presence the city accepted with a mixture of amusement and terror, received orders from the tribunal. Yes, but she also attended to the practicalities of a human instrument, the state of the blade, the habits of a day when rain made the ropes slick, the availability of wagons to bring prisoners from hinterland jails. The municipal clerk's quill set the sentence. 100 small hands and habits arranged the hour. He produced, then, a little notebook as if to apologize for the intimacy of what he would show me. It was not the public ledger, the fearsome codex, that made people fold their hands, but a journeyman's book. The kind of record one keeps to remember which plane was best for a particular wood grain, which rope frayed after certain storms. The pages were tobacco-stained, penciled lines timid beside the clerk's ink, and in those pencil lines were names and notes not for posterity but for survival. Arrived late, cart broke axle. Delay to third column. Rope wet. It was a small, terrible arithmetic. The hand that had written those notes had also written observations that read like the index of survival. Children at market noon shout for bread, do not open gate too soon. I sat and handled the book as though it were a patient body, closed the air by pressing my palms together so the tremor of my fingers would not betray me. To take in such detail was to understand that the ledger I had made my enemy was not a prophetic machine, but an administrative system grafted onto a people's want. Each marginal scroll had a reason that was often practical and sometimes venal. A clerk's note could be a quill pressed by fear of reprisal. An informer could sell a date at the price of bread. The list that made people sleep badly was stitched from smaller seams. And is that all? I asked, knowing already that there was never an all when one examined the mechanisms of power. Are the names only the product of artisanship and compromises? He looked at me as one man whose life bore marks of 100 practicalities might look at someone who kept their life to a ledger. No. Sometimes the order is moral. Sometimes the tribunal chooses to make an example. Sometimes it is a matter of time. So many bodies cannot be disposed of in one day, so the order is staggered. But there is no divine schedule. There are only human reasons, and for the moment, the human reasons are ignorant of the ledger you carry. He did not use my manuscript's title nor its name. He did not have to. The shop smelled of glue, and the seam of the day had a sobered light that made the thread of my life visible. He told me that if a carriage broke at the bridge, names shifted. If a rope frayed, appointments postponed. If a clerk miscounted, the innocent might be caught in the tumble while the guilty waited. The trade of